Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Intimate Polygon Investor Webinar hosted by my company, Token Relations. I am Jacqueline Melinek, and joining me today, more importantly, is Marc, the CEO of Polygon Labs. Marc, how are you?
Doing great. How are you, Jacqueline?
Great. It's always great to talk to you. So I'm excited to catch up, and there's a lot to cover here. So I'd love to start with, in addition to the discussion, we will also take some Q&A at the end. We've gathered some questions. So if you have any, feel free to post them in the chat or save them, and we'll try to get to you. With that said, Marc can get started with some background and context. Feel free to take it away.
Cool. Yeah, so really big thing for me is looking back over the last quarter. I want to provide some very clear updates on kind of where we're at after Q2, really what we've accomplished and then what we have ahead. So you're going to hear a lot about payments today, a little bit about RWAs, and a lot of that's because Q2 is the first full quarter where you get to see a little bit of the results from our efforts in kind of the payments work streams that we've had. And that's something that's going to be reflected in numbers that we walk through, but also some of the strategy that we talk about. So turning maybe a bit to numbers here, as I was mentioning. Really some high level updates here to give everyone a big picture of just how big the Polygon POS ecosystem is. We'll start there. We're now at 5.4 billion transactions processed all time, which is absolutely massive. 284 million in Q2 alone, putting Polygon again as one of the top chains. Fees continue to stay incredibly low on Polygon, with average fees being a tenth of a cent and really below a tenth of a cent. Similarly, when we look at kind of addresses and the growth of addresses there, obviously, as we all know, trying to determine users on a blockchain is incredibly difficult. The closest proxy we can do is try to determine what a unique address really looks like. So somebody who's actually transacting on the chain, right? So we had 15.3 million addresses onboarded in Q2, which is about an average of 9.4 million monthly addresses and 1.2 million daily active addresses. So number of users is continuing to increase, consistent with some of the other growth that we'll see, and see that on the next slide. Cool. A lot of that's driven by the stablecoin ecosystem on Polygon POS. Anyone following us knows that even as of today, only a month into the end of the quarter, these numbers already feel outdated. But if we talk about what Q2 looked like, we had $2.8 billion of stablecoins on Polygon POS. That's a 40% increase for the quarter, and now 72% increase year to date. Nice thing when you talk about this from a stablecoins perspective is that you're really not talking about the market just increasing in value. You're actually talking about onboarding of new stablecoins, which is much more meaningful. On top of that, what we saw is stablecoin volumes increasing by 90% from Q1 to $385 billion in Q2. Monthly active addresses for stablecoin specifically, that in terms of the average amount transacted was 5.08 million, up 32% for Q1. And we had 236 million stablecoin transfers completed, which again is up 24% from Q1. So what we see here is for us, not surprisingly internally, as we've been focused on stablecoins, but we see a significant increase upwards by very meaningful amounts month over month, but also if you were to compare that to last year as well. Next slide. Okay. There's some areas that actually stand out in terms of payments for on Polygon. One of the things that we do is we take out any kind of peer-to-contract payments so that we can really analyze the type of peer-to-peer payments that actually existed on Polygon. And so we group these into small, middle, and large transactions. And Polygon is the #1 chain when it comes to small transactions. There's an 86% increase in volume on transactions between $100 and $1,000, a 68% increase in volume of transactions between $1,000 and $10,000, which we'll consider these mid-tier transactions. So when you combine that, you'll see Polygon as the #1 chain in those transactions. This is very meaningful because when you look at peer-to-peer transactions and not peer-to-contract transactions, what you start being able to pull out is transactions that are actually useful for a specific purpose, often tied to like retail payments, freelance payments, team salaries, vendor payments, things of that nature. A lot of this driven by fintechs in various regions, in addition to just showing a complete kind of ecosystem on Polygon. Next slide. All right. We talked about the large payments. This is really an area, the small payments and medium payments, where we really stand out. Large payments is an area where we have a desire to grow. We're not necessarily one of the leaders right now, but what we are seeing is significant growth there. Given that our focus really is on many of the real world use cases, those are not generally the ones driving the large payments in the same way. But what we did see is 15.8 billion in large payments volumes in Q2. So these are 10K plus type payments. Similarly, that's a significant increase still in terms of a 30% increase in volumes. Again, like these types of things are going to be more of a different nature when it comes to the higher value transfers and more like remittance type transfers and things of that nature that really would require bigger size. Next slide. All right, so we talked a lot about payments, given that's been a big area. The other thing that you'll hear, and if you don't know already, is our focus on RWAs. In Q2 alone, we've seen a increase in RWAs on chain in general in terms of like players. So one of the things that we care about at Polygon, knowing that we already have more than 20 tokenized funds on Polygon, having more tokenized funds alone is not actually that interesting. It doesn't drive any value. It's not useful to people. What we want to do is actually bring RWAs that are going to drive value to the holders of those RWAs, but also the chain. And so a lot of this has been a focus on bringing those types of use cases, right? So a big one is Apollo's ACRED, that is a securitized fund with a underlying Apollo private credit fund. Seeing that deployed and being able to be used in looping strategies has been great. A China AMC fund led by kind of AlloAX being tokenized and coming to Polygon. Spyco, which has long been a leader tokenizing funds and assets on Polygon, tokenized additional money market funds over there. Mercado Bitcoin on the private credit side as well. And then just in general, Securitize bringing like a mix of assets over there. And so we're continuing to focus on bringing more RWAs, but really doing that in a thoughtful way. That is not just we have more funds here, but instead a description, a reflection of usefulness of these assets on chain. Go to the next slide, please. What all of this has kind of resulted in is Polygon seeing a huge influx of funds in general. Obviously, Ethereum is the leader here and by a wide margin. But when we look at net flows in the last 3 months, you see Polygon right up at the top. Obviously, it's important looking at the net flows so that we take into account both inflows and outflows. But really, I think the driver here, a lot of this is really on the stablecoin side in terms of what we talked about. And that's why we were able to add more than $475 million in assets on the Polygon side of things. Next slide. All right, so turning to token performance. One of the things that I think we can say is when you look at the numbers we just walked through, and then you look at the token, what you see is, from our perspective, a massively underpriced asset. And I think a lot of this just reflects the noise around Polygon in general. You can see that kind of in these numbers, in that what we've seen is, a price range, around like the mid 16 cents to 27.5 cents. Seen average depth of 216K on exchanges. And in terms of trading volumes, 85 million daily average, 254 million at a peak. And the monthly average is around 2.64 billion. So a total of 7.92 billion pull traded in Q2. To me, when I look at these numbers, there's something that we are very actively focused on improving, especially given what we'll talk about, which is the underlying changes to like the infra that are meaningfully improving. in addition to actual uses of Polygon POS increasing.
Yeah, no, that was really great. And I feel like going through that whole Q2 report, I noticed there's been a lot of developments around stablecoins. Where is this coming from, and why is Polygon so focused on stablecoins right now?
Yeah, so one core thesis on our side is that no general purpose chain is going to be able to handle all of the volumes in crypto. And we go back at Polygon to what we're really trying to accomplish. And ultimately, we want a trustless internet that allows anyone to do anything they want anytime with their assets. And before, this was something that you could only potentially accomplish on a chain. That is really what people were focused on building. And Polygon POS did this very, very well. The second we started building out the AG layer as a alternative infrastructure that actually makes it viable to have an internet on many different chains that can grow, have Web3 grow to the size of the internet, what you start realizing is that you don't need chains to solve that. You can actually have chains solve specific purposes. And so on the Polygon POS side, when we took a deep dive late last year into what Polygon POS was actually really good at, we realized that there were so many verticals that we were attacking that we did well in, whether it is DeFi or DePIN or gaming or payments or RWAs. But we also realized is that we could build something more valuable if we actually focused on a use case and captured that market. And thankfully for us, I think we had started focusing on payments and RWAs before many others, both in terms of over the last many years, but specifically starting late last year with that focus. And so one of the things that's been a focus is really building kind of a global payment infrastructure around Polygon POS. And that's really what is necessary for stablecoins to grow. And so we've continued leaning into that. And as a sector specific chain, that means that we can really build something that is more specific to it. As an example of this, we can build block space in a way that brings faster finality than you would need on a gaming chain. Similarly, if we think about DEX infrastructure, you can focus the DEX infrastructure around stablecoins much more than around other assets. Same thing on the RWA side. When you think about the type of infrastructure that you want on the chain around RWAs, it is very different from what you want in a general purpose ecosystem. So focusing on this specific area allows us to meet the needs of developers and users on the chain in a way that we can't do as well as a general purpose chain.
Stablecoins and payments are also closely connected, right? So when it comes to building out these strategies from Polygon Labs, how do you kind of think about tapping into the growth of payments on chain with that in mind?
Yeah, so building a little bit on the last answer, one of the things that anyone involved in payments wants is they want low fees, they want a stability in fees, and they want fast finality. Now, importantly here, and this is where building a chain for a purpose from a technical perspective matters, is that you can differentiate chains. So if we think about a gaming chain doesn't need fast finality. You don't need to spend the money on infrastructure for fast finality. Instead, what they need is something like fast pre-confirmations that gives a great user experience. But if you have a transaction that doesn't actually go through once in a while, it's acceptable. From a payments perspective, it's not. And this is why actually focusing on faster finality, for example, on Polygon POS has been important. This also obviously drives their stablecoin strategy. If we were continuing to be a general purpose chain, then we need to focus on bringing liquidity to as many tokens as we can. And right now, what we focus on is really bringing liquidity to stablecoins in general, right? And so we see stablecoins like USDC and USDT being very kind of broadly adopted on Polygon because those fees are very, very low. And we can help build more liquidity in those chains specifically. On top of this, Polygon's always been a provider of infrastructure that is very liked and trusted by institutions. And so when we think about things from a strategic perspective, we need to lean into the brand that has been built at Polygon. And when anyone goes and talks to an institution about coming on chain, one of the first names that comes up is Polygon. And the reasons for that is we've had trusted infrastructure for a very long time, and now we're focused on making that trusted infrastructure even better for those institutions in terms of that efficiency that we can bring. Add in the fact that you have on-ramps and off-ramps around the entire globe, that makes it even easier for institutions to end up adopting Polygon. So those are some of the things that, when it comes to like the strategic aspects of it, is really thinking through what it is that kind of institutions that are going to be tapping into payments want, so that we can continue the growth that we've had.
I also want to talk to you a bit about the recent growth in small USDC transfers on Polygon. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it has surged a lot this year. You could probably tell me the numbers better than I can, but I would love to hear you kind of talk me through why you think that is, and like, what are you seeing on your end?
Yeah, so when you think of the nature of Polygon POS and how it's built, it really is amenable to kind of these small transfers being done very fast. And as I already walked through around the numbers, this is coming true, right? So when we look at USDC transfers under $1,000 on Polygon, we've seen 141% surge this year in that type of adoption. Now we're outpacing Solana when it comes to low value USDC transfers, again, because of that efficiency, those low fees. On Tron, what you've started seeing is actually a significant increase in fees, and Tron has been the dominant player when it comes to stablecoins, especially USDT. We have actually had fintechs move their infrastructure over from Tron to Polygon at user demand as a result of those fees actually increasing. And so when Tron transfers went from, up to, I think it was even over $7, you could still transfer USDC on Polygon for fractions of a cent. This has led to global growth, but I'd say it's especially strong in South America, with Argentina and Brazil being the leaders there. When we look at the numbers, what we see is that almost 50% of all stablecoin transfers using USDC in Argentina are on Polygon. This is still not the same scale as what we see when it comes to USDT, but the growth of USDC and Polygon's growth with it has been very meaningful in those regions, in LATAM specifically. Now, there's also an important part about our presence globally, including in those places, is because when we think about payment infrastructure and what payment providers want, they do want global infrastructure. And specifically, it is hard to grow as a payment merchant, as a payment provider globally. But when you have infrastructure that allows for your users to use your infrastructure, and then be able to still get the services that they need in another country that you're not available in, that makes using something like Polygon much more desirable. Now, the way that we've done this has been first focusing on the underlying infrastructure, but on top of that, actually growing our payments team significantly. So our payments team has more than quadrupled in the past 6 months. And it is solely focused on payments, with another team focused on RWAs. And so as we grow on the stablecoin side of things, what this does, it also opens opportunities on RWA side of things. What we fundamentally believe is that as you bring a lot of this stablecoin volume and needs to institutions and to fintechs, what they're going to do is then leverage kind of the infrastructure that they've already built and their customer base to then move into RWAs. And that is part of the reason why Polygon's been able to focus on that area as well. As we'll talk about.
I wanted to dive into RWA, so it's a perfect segue. You mentioned it as part of Polygon's vision, but how is Polygon expanding into real world assets, and what kind of role does tokenization play in that broader strategy too? And here's some headlines that we saw on this front as well.
Yeah, so I think there's a natural fit, as I was mentioning, between stablecoins and RWAs. And in some ways, you could say stablecoins are a subsector of RWAs. But I think more importantly, it's who is leveraging stablecoins and RWAs being tokenization of, let's call them like non-cash type assets. And generally what we see is a lot of overlap between those two. So as you're building relationships and growing the use of payments on Polygon, it like naturally makes sense to also bring our RWAs into that mix. Obviously, as everyone knows, when you think about RWAs, it's an absolutely massive market that has hardly been tapped into, partially because of regulatory restraints so far, but also to some degree when it comes to infrastructure. What we've seen, right, is a start where most of these tokenized assets are very limited to things like US treasuries. And that is a good start, but it's very hard to actually grow those beyond stablecoin type use cases, simply because the yield on those is not actually as meaningful as yield that you'll get on other RWAs. And so when we think about the RWA sector and what it is that we're targeting, it's really trying to go beyond just the tokenization of really money market funds that hold treasuries, but instead actually looking at RWAs that are generally higher yielding and are things that actually are different from stablecoins. They provide a different value proposition that institutions want to offer. And so the RWA infrastructure has been getting built out. We've partnered with risk curators around Morpho and Morpho themselves in terms of being able to bring that infrastructure that a lot of them want. And this has been true also when we look beyond just Polygon POS at RWAs. As an example, Lumia is a chain built using AgLayer CDK on AgLayer. It is an RWA native chain, and they offer very specialized infrastructure for RWAs as well. When we see something like this, we're very supportive of it, because ultimately, if you look at global RWA demand, no chain is going to be able to handle that demand. And Polygon POS is not going to be able to handle the entire global payments and RWAs needs that there are. But given our build out of the AgLayer, we can support other teams that are doing the same and actually work together to offer differentiated infrastructure for different needs. And Lumia is like a great example of this. So this also allows us to use kind of as an example use case with an initial product. We can give it as a use case for other enterprises, an example of like layer 2 type RWAs. So we have Lumia there. This now allows other institutions to now take a look at how it is that you can leverage AgLayer CDK for your own chain. And obviously this is starting to happen more broadly, but it's something that we're spending a lot of time on the Polygon side as well.
Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about technical advancements that have happened recently so that we will be able to tie those back to this mission that we're discussing. Can you kind of walk us through the upgraded changes that have been made to Polygon in recent months?
Yeah. So ultimately, with our kind of renewed focus on stablecoins and RWAs, this also means that we need to make changes to Polygon POS that is consistent with that. One of those changes is getting much higher TPS and much faster finality. And so we released what we refer to as the GigaGas roadmap, which is intended to bring Polygon to 100,000 transactions per second and to get us to instant finality. The goal here is that while we fulfill those, like I'll call them more protocol layer changes, we're also able to bring in features like account abstraction that actually allow for developers to create this very easy experience for users. So one of the big upgrades that came through in this quarter was really upgrading Heimdall v2. Upgrading to Heimdall v2. Effectively, what this means is that we affected probably the biggest or second biggest upgrade in blockchain history. And effectively what we did was replace the entire Heimdall layer, as we call it, as part of Polygon POS, with an entirely new layer. Now, what this allowed for us to do is cut down time to finality to about 5 seconds, when previously it was over a minute. As part of that, we also increased the transactions per second, and that is now in the thousands, whereas before it was in the hundreds. we have other upgrades that are going to be coming beyond that. So as part of that, we also had this kind of smart account support, which was part of implementing Ethereum's EIP 7702. Again, this is really about the user experience. But that alone, from our perspective, gets us to a point where we've started making changes that we want to see. But ultimately, we need to take a step further. And so some of the additional changes that we'll have this year that we'll talk about in the future are things like bringing single slot finality to Polygon, which eliminates all reorgs. It's increasing TPS into the higher, 5 to 10,000 TPS this year. And once we get to that point, we can fill so much more block space on Polygon POS that will allow apps to come without any hesitation, especially when it comes to doing things at scale when it comes to stablecoins than what they've been able to do historically. So I think when you look at Polygon as it is right now, you can go look at any chain in crypto, and what you'll probably determine is that Polygon is in the top 3 most performant chains. And when you look at it specifically for payments purposes, what you're going to start realizing is that the block space and the demands for payments are going to be matching up to what Polygon is actually developing. And that is going to allow for institutions, peer-to-peer payments to come to Polygon with much more specific tooling and block space for them than will exist anywhere else.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was actually going to ask you, like, why does this matter for payments and RWAs? And with all these upgrades in mind, like what should institutions know about them?
Yeah, the big thing for institutions is right now, a lot of institutions view blockchains as simply blockchains. And that is it. That's all they know. And that's the way that they think about them. And the simple reason for this is because it's been true historically. When you think about that historically, what you've had is that you've had blockchains that look identical and they get faster and faster. But at a certain point, they're fast enough and they're cheap enough. And that isn't a differentiator at all anymore. And that is what we're trying to really get ahead of, is really recognizing the fact that we could continue to be like every other general purpose chain and continue to just get faster and cheaper in a very generalized way. But when you're an institution, what you're going to start to realize is that right now, when you are transacting and you need some specific tool because you want to evolve what you're doing, you're going to go look around at a chain and you're going to realize that that tool doesn't exist that you want. And the simple reason is because they haven't taken the time to build it, because A, they're not experts in payments and they don't have that expertise internally. And same thing in RWAs. Or 2, they haven't had the resources or the time to do it because they're busy focusing on 5 or 6 other sectors. A lot of times what you'll also see is that a lot of chains focus in a certain area and then they shift their focus like very, very quickly, depending on the market, right? The gaming market heats up and suddenly a chain wants to focus on gaming. And then Deepin heats up and they want to focus on Deepkin, and then meme coins heat up and they want to focus on that. Polygon POS, you know that you're just going to consistently get delivered what is best for you for settlement, for stable coins and payments and RWAs. And that's what we see on kind of from like 3 different perspectives. One of them is when it comes to the chain itself. The second one is when it comes to, I'll call this kind of social layer, in terms of really focusing in a certain area, so that when you come to Polygon and you say, I need to talk to somebody in payments, you can talk to them about it, or subsector of payments, then you can go ahead and talk to them about it. You can find the support that you need. And then lastly is around the tooling. And so those are all things that institutions will get on Polygon that really aren't broadly available.
Yeah, I think, you've been talking about a lot of the improvements to Polygon, and then Polygon Labs also has been busy across other areas incubating different products that add value to the ecosystem, right? Some recent examples, I think, include spinning out Miden, which raised $25 million in seed funding, and unveiling Katana with GSR, both part of the AgLayer breakout program. Can you kind of walk us through the program and tell us how this creates value for POL stakers or POL stakers?
Yeah. So one of the things, if we go back a couple of years, is Polygon started doing a lot of things. And there's good to that and there's bad to that. When you do a lot of different things, You're diversified, but your odds of success in any one area go down. And one of the things we realized is that we can actually create significantly more value if we focus on an area and then we ensure that these other products that we're working on are able to be successful elsewhere and drive value back to Pol. So examples of this are Polygon Maiden, for example. We spun them out. They then raised $25 million in seed funding, and Pol stakers will end up benefiting from an airdrop from them. Same thing with Billions. Incubated them as what people knew as Polygon ID. They spun out, and now Billions is going to go out and raise capital and has been seeing significant growth around the kind of ID area. And that value is going to return back to Pol stakers. Similarly, we decided to incubate Katana internally. And as part of Katana, what we did was ensure that there would be a 15% airdrop to Pol stakers, which again is a very meaningful amount. And so what this allows for us to do is really focus on building out AgLayer and Polygon POS with our resources, and then allow for these other projects, which will end up adding value to the AgLayer and to Pol stakers, to go increase their odds of success independently.
Okay. And so AgLayer has grown a lot in the past quarter. With the launch of Katana, we talked about that. It has around 400 million in TVL, which is a lot in little over a month after a launch. Can you kind of walk us through what is Katana doing, and how do you kind of see it changing not only the DeFi landscape, but contributing to AgLayer's growth as well, and honestly, like the domino effect that it's going to bring?
Yeah, one of the things we recognized before creating Katana was that when you're building out something like the AgLayer and you want to attract a lot of different networks to a new network, effectively what you need to do is give them a reason to go there, right? At a certain point, you start hitting a certain critical mass where you get the network effects that you need to continue to grow, but you need to find a way to start that. And through conversations with a lot of different chains that are already built on the AgLayer, or those who want to come to the AgLayer, what they don't want to need to do is build out DeFi infrastructure. There's multiple reasons for this. A, you need block space that is very specialized for DeFi if you actually want to build it right. Right now, a lot of DeFi doesn't happen on specialized block space, and people accept that. And so you could get away with not doing that. But then the second thing that you need is a lot of different pieces of infrastructure. And these pieces of infrastructure are ones that don't want to come to a chain that is not going to be focused on DeFi, or where revenue generated for them is not high enough. And so they have difficulty attracting that type of infrastructure. And this could be lending protocols. It could be the highest quality DEXs. It could be kind of curators around that. It could be market makers around that. And then lastly, they don't want to split their attention on what they're building for purposes of DeFi. And so the idea behind Katana is that if we can create a chain that can serve as a hub of liquidity for the rest of the AgLayer, then it's going to make it much more desirable for those chains to stay on the AgLayer and to come to the AgLayer in the first place. When we went out and looked at how do we actually attract a chain of that nature, what we started doing was looking at what chains look like for DeFi purposes. And what we realized is that no chain is built well for DeFi. And this is no different for Polygon POS than it is for Solana, than it is for Arbitrum, than it is for Ethereum. And the reason for this is because while we've talked a lot about fragmentation of liquidity across chains, fragmentation of liquidity within chains is just as serious or more serious of a problem. When you look at liquidity within chains, you have 10, 20, 30 DEXs. You have multiple lending protocols. They're all attracting capital into their own ecosystems and fighting for capital. But the thing is, when you start digging into how much capital is in any one of these protocols, the number is a fraction of what is actually available on the chain as a whole. When you go even one layer deeper and you start digging into how much liquidity is in any one of these pools, you start realizing that the numbers are very, very small. A number that I often talk about is around stablecoin transactions. When you look at the deepest liquidity of a USDC, USDT pool in all of crypto, doing $10 billion of volume a month, what you're realizing is that there is only $30 million of liquidity in that pool. That is nothing. If you want to bring FX on chain, you'll be able to have a couple major players execute a transaction a day at max, and that's it. Now, when you start, by the way, in that example, taking that across multiple types of currencies, it's even worse. If you concentrate all of that liquidity, then you actually have a much better chance of creating deeper liquidity that can attract more volumes. The same thing is on the yield side. When we look at whether yield is actually maximized on these chains, we realize that they're not. And so Katana is really built with the goal of deepening liquidity and creating higher yields so that users on the chain, but also any chain on the ag layer, can execute cross-chain transactions, tapping into that liquidity, allowing for those chains to come to the ag layer without ever needing to worry about DeFi, but offering DeFi to their users and easily being able to benefit from the users on Katana who are there, who might want to use their chains. And so when that ends up happening and you play that out over time, you end up having a chain like Katana that drives massive volumes for cross-chain transactions. Those cross-chain transactions are all for the benefit of Pol stakers in the long run. And so that is really how Katana ends up contributing to the ag layer in a meaningful way.
Sorry for the technical difficulties on my end, but Marc, I heard you talking about the ag layer is going to be powered by Pol. Some people might have forgotten that the significant token upgrade from Matic to Pol, which happened a little while back, which is sort of at the center of this conversation, right? What are the steps in that Polygon Labs is taking to support this transition and improve liquidity for Pol as well?
Yeah, so taking kind of multiple steps on this front. First of all, very actively started to work with market makers in a way we didn't around Matic, around Pol. And there's two purposes of that. One of that is Pol being an upgrade, but effectively also being a kind of a new token when it comes to exchanges. We needed liquidity to be supported over there. So started working much more actively with market makers around Pol than we had in the past. Number two is we kicked off a very broad marketing campaign around the transition from Matic to Pol. I think that transition's been quite successful. Initially, it was rocky, but really where we're at now is more than 90% of that liquidity has been migrated over. There's only a couple exchanges left who we're working with in terms of helping educate their users and getting them to migrate over. And so by the end of this year, we'll be well over 95% of the liquidity being migrated over from Matic to Pol. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is kind of keeping in mind like how Pol actually accrues value, because a lot of time Pol gets grouped with other L2s. And even though Polygon itself is technically a sidechain and not an L2, it gets grouped with L2s. But Polygon is actually incredibly different from that. When you think of like most L2s, they're effectively tokens that are used for governance, and they don't have much utility or value kind of beyond it. Polygon's very different, right? You can think of it as something that is actually useful in the network. You can stake it, lend it, use it as collateral. But most importantly, its value in staking is not just that it supports the network and receives a Pol in exchange for doing that, but it's also that it's kind of rewarded for providing that service to the ecosystem, right? And when you think of the various airdrops that are going to be coming to Pol holders in the form of, whether it's from Maiden or Billions or Katana, they're kind of very, very meaningful. When you think about like the growth that is happening in the ecosystem, that benefit is all going to be coming to Pol. None of that is seen right now in something like the ag layer, but as that becomes something that comes to life, cross-chain transactions start coming to life, people start paying for them, that's all the value that's accruing to Pol. And so ultimately, like I often summarize it as like, yeah, all you do is stake Pol, but there's so much more you can do with your Pol when you stake, and the ways that you accrue value around Pol when it comes to fees and emissions and airdrops is much more significant than what you see in other ecosystems. And that's why I was saying at the very beginning, when I think of Pol, personally, and I tie it into the performance of Pol when I see what is happening on kind of in the POS ecosystem and the actual development of ag layer. And to me, it often like doesn't reflect reality.
Yeah. Marc, my last major question for you is when it comes to leadership, you have been leading Polygon Labs SEO for about 2 years now. And there's also been some structural changes across other entities, which I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Can you kind of tell us a little bit more about the decision behind that?
Yeah. So actually, I hope in the future that we're going to have Sandeep on
Yeah,
these. He had an event
we
that he had to
definitely
be at.
bring
It's
them on.
personal.
Yeah.
Everyone got stuck with just me instead of me and Sandeep or just Sandeep. But no, I think this is like more important than most people realize, because for a while, like when Polygon had become massive, it really tried to like solidify itself in from like a governance perspective, both like internally but also externally. And internally, what that reflected in was frankly a lot more slow moving decision making at the board level and leadership level in general. And when we announced earlier this year that Sandeep was kind of taking control of the board of Polygon Foundation, becoming the CEO over there, this was like very meaningful because it allows for us to move with much greater speed and clarity than we've done in the past. And so what we're seeing is much faster execution around Polygon POS than we have seen historically. The same is true around releases when it comes to the ag layer. Internally, teams have way more consistent roadmaps and execution on those roadmaps. And so overall, like the resources and the speed is being concentrated in a much better way than it has been in the past. And so when it comes to, people often ask like what that means in terms of Sandeep and me, the way that I often describe it is that unlike a lot of other companies in the space where you have a labs that owns equity and a foundation that is helping pursue the ecosystem, which ends up creating a significant conflict of interest between equity holders and token holders. Polygon doesn't actually have that. Polygon Foundation actually owns Polygon Labs, which executes on all the operations. And so while Sandeep makes kind of the key strategic leadership decisions, including around kind of capital, I execute on kind of the vision on a day-to-day basis.
Amazing. Well, Marc, there are a ton of developments going on your end, so I'm sure there's no shortage of things that we could talk about. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your insights, and thank you to everyone who listened in. Looking forward to talking again with you and the team next quarter.
Great. So am I. Thank you.